Hello, I am Raj Vedam, and in this video I'd like to address some questions that I got from some high school students. About 3 weeks or so back, I got an email from some students in Finland who described themselves as doing a history course which focuses on encounters between cultures. And the history of India is part of the course, and one of the topics on the larger project down of the course is Aryan invasion theory of India. And they had researched that topic and stumbled upon my talk in YouTube on Sangam Talks. And based on that, they had some questions. Now, at the very outset, I'd like to say I greatly appreciate the students for having researched my talk and taken the time to question some of the assertions that I'm making and asking for clarifications. I'm very happy to do that, and I hope this video will satisfy that. So the first question: why has the Aryan invasion theory spread so widely? How has it affected the people of India in the past, and how does it continue to do so now? Are the effects all negative, or is there something positive in them as well? That's an excellent question. So to answer that, I'd like to first talk about what is the Aryan invasion or the migration theory. Well, it turns out that William Jones, who's a colonialist, founder of Asiatic Society, when he studied Sanskrit, he found to his amazement that there are common roots between Sanskrit, Latin, and Greek. So ever since he found this commonality, Europeans have always wanted to know what is their identity as Westerners, how are they related to the Indian people, why are the languages related. So these led to people adopting various mechanisms to address this issue, and one of them obviously was linguistics. So linguistics was born in the 19th century, where they tried to address some of these questions, and one of the greatest developments was something called comparative method. In this comparative method, they compared the phonology, syntax, morphology of closely related languages and attempted to reconstruct a proto-language. The issues are that it is subjective, it is informal, it lacks testability. It also fails if the languages are compared to ancient ones. Other developments have also come about, like lexicostatistics or glottochronology and so on. In general, the idea is based upon sound laws. How do sounds change from one language to the other, especially in the cognates? Cognates meaning the same meaning in different languages. For example, A greater than B means the sound A is older and it changes to sound B, which is more recent. Similarly, B less than A means a similar meaning over here. And one such law is, for example, the Grimm's law, where the hard bha is an older version than bha, older version than pa, older version than fa. So one gets an idea how these kind of word changes from one language to the other, how the sounds change, was used to construct some kind of rules. And based on these rules, linguists came about with ideas on how languages might have dispersed. And very soon this linguistic theory and the endeavor of Eurocentric people to try to see where their origins are led to German Aryanism, for example. In 1878, this German philologist, Giger, he was the first to suggest that Indo-Europeans were blonde, blue-eyed, and these traits had become diluted and darkened in those places where there is a foreign admixture of genes. Now, how that comes about from linguistic analysis is anybody's guess. Anyway, this was pulled out of a hat, and this somehow became received wisdom going down the road. At the same time, there were dubious interpretations of verses in the Sanskrit works like the Vedic texts, and they produced readings of fair, invading Aryans, clashing with snub-nosed indigenous dasas. So they reinforced these ideas that even the Sanskrit works, the Vedas, contain an account of invasions, and they further attempted to further the blonde cause with simplistic logics like that, where people like Theodore, they accepted without question that original Aryans spoke Indo-Europeans and were blonde people. Even in those early days, 1936, the Indian scholar B.N. Datta, He criticized Germanism, saying that it arose among the peculiar political conditions in 19th century Germany, and there is no reason why Indians should pin anthropological faith in it. Going on, it turned out that the notion that there was languages are all related led to the idea that there was a proto-language or an ancestral language. And if there was an ancestral language, there must have been speakers of that ancestral language. And the question came, where did these speakers live? And that led to a quest for where is the homeland? And the homeland turned out to have been proposed in a whole lot of places, as you can see from these circles, from Germany to Finland to Sweden to other such places to Ukraine and so on to the Caspian Sea, Black Sea area, on to this part of Central Asia, even into Armenia and places like that, Georgia and Armenia, as well as northwest India. All these were considered to be homelands at some point or the other. Eventually, the linguists settled upon the area between the Caspian Sea and the Black Sea as the origin for the ancestral language called Proto-Indo-European. So this reconstruction using comparative method led to this kind of an idealization. Idealization meaning that they reconstructed academically an hypothetical ancient ancestral language called Proto-Indo-European, from whom these daughter languages were born. Languages like Balto-Slavic, Germanic, Celtic, Italic, Hellenic, Indo-Iranian, Iranian, Indic, and Sanskrit. So this kind of an idealized model was proposed, and this has become the received wisdom today. However, there are a lot of people who have studied these methods, addressed their lack of formality or testability, and critiqued them and try to see if these methods are true, where would such a language have been born? There are such issues also out there. Anyway, to give you an example how such a reconstruction was done, even today, if you go to the rural parts of India, we see the very familiar bullock cart with these wheels, and these familiar wheels are seen in Harappa, the ancient Harappa in the Indus Valley civilization. We see that even there today, and including the wheel is seen in Ukraine and places like that going back to 3800 BCE and so on. And if we look at the words for the technology of the bullock cart, things like the wheel, the nave, the hub, the axle, and all of these things in various languages, Sanskrit, Latin, Greek, Hittite, Tocharian. The wheel is chakra in Sanskrit, rotum in Latin, kuklos in Greek, and so on. Yoke is yoga or lugam over here. Nave is nabya or umbilicus. Axle is aksa or axis. So the proposed reconstruction from Proto-Indo-European is, people said that there was a word called kweklo. Anything with a star means it's not a real word, it's a reconstructed word. This reconstructed word, they propose, morphed into the Proto-Indo-Iranian word called kekro. Again, there is no evidence for this word except that it is reconstructed with a star over here. And this gave rise to the real Sanskrit word called chakra. So this gives a flavor for how a roundabout theory has been made. The data to construct the Proto-Indo-European languages mostly come from Sanskrit. Having got the data from Sanskrit to reconstruct what is called the Proto-Indo-European language, ancestral language, they have turned around and made the assumption into a fact and the facts into assumptions. So this is the absurd circular nature of some of the arguments in linguistics. Anyway, in recent times, we have seen that linguistics has been fused with archaeology in addition as the quest for Western identity continues. For example, Gustav Kosina, his defense of a German homeland in 1902 was based upon looking at the archaeological record, the movement of people linked with ceramic changes in the archaeological record. He believed the spread of the corded ware and the linear ware archaeological cultures are indicative of Aryan dispersals. And his methodology is that distinctive artifact types are equated with cultures. The distribution of such types represents cultural provinces, and such provinces can be equated to tribal, or ethnic groups. So these assumptions were formative to later works also, especially the works by Maria Gimbutas, and we're going to see that. The bottom line is the Indian identity is key in the positioning of the Western identity. If you want to answer who the Western people are, you need to answer who the Indian people are first. If you can answer that, then you can answer this question. That is why Aryan invasion theory is the centerpiece as well as the tail end of the Western narrative. So there are two modern narratives today for the language expansion. The thought leaders are Maria Gimbutas as well as Colin Renfrew. Maria Gimbutas comes with Kurgan or the steppe hypothesis, where she says that the Indo-European language expansion happened in three waves between 4000 BCE to 1500 BCE. On the other hand, Professor Colin Renfrew says the Anatolian hypothesis, the invention of agriculture in Anatolia or Turkey and its spread in 6500 BCE was the impetus for language dispersal also, according to him. However, today most people favor the Kurgan or the steppe hypothesis. So what is this Kurgan or steppe hypothesis? This one says 3500 BC between the Caspian Sea and Black Sea, the Yamnaya people. At that period of time, we had civilization in Egypt, in Sumeria, in Harappa, Birana, Megar, Bimbetka, Lothkar, people living in Erekal, in China. So it is not the story of civilization. It is only a constructed story of who the European people are in relation to the Indian people. So these people in Yamnaya are supposed to have domesticated the wild horse. And once they domesticated the wild horse, they're supposed to have gone out in several waves. And it says by 2500 BCE, they spread to the west as corded ware people, to the east as Andronovo people, and going on to 1500 BC, they specialized in the Hittites, Mycenaeans, Babylonians, and such people. And we see the Bactria Margiana archaeological complex here entering into Sindh in India. And this is the beginning of the Aryan invasion theory for Indians. And eventually by 500 BCE, these people are supposed to have spread all over the northern plains of India, having driven the original people to the south who became the Dravidians. So you see the appearance of Dravidians in the record over here. All of this is the hypothesis of this Kurgan or steppe by Maria Gimbutas and others. And so we are now in a position to say, what is this Aryan invasion migration theory? It says bands of male warriors from Central Asia invaded or migrated to India around 1500 BCE. They effectively replaced the existing civilization. They brought an entirely new Vedic religion, Sanskrit language, Vedic ecosystem, and so on. So this is what we can formally define this as now. So one of your questions was, why has the Aryan invasion theory spread so widely? Well, it turns out that there are several inimical frameworks that have enforced this narrative on the Indian history. And we see that with the onset of colonial hegemony. People like the Portuguese, the Dutch, the French, and the British, who at various points invaded India between 16th to the 20th century, they came about with this narrative. So that is one component of the story. Every time the colonialists came about, they came hand in hand with Christian imperialism. Between 1500s to present times, we see missionaries like Robert Caldwell, Geo Pope, and others. And they came hand in hand with the scholarship in Eurocentrism, with agencies such as linguistics, anthropology, and caste, people like Herbert Risley, Max Muller, 1700s to present. Now, with circular arguments, these three agencies, in order to reconcile with their unique ideologies, they came about with the Aryan invasion and the migration theories, and I've discussed this at length in my talk on the motivations of these various agencies. And going into modern times, we are seeing that there are newer frameworks that are reinforcing the received wisdom from these earlier narratives. For example, 1800s to present, we are seeing the entrenchment of this notion of Aryan migration or invasion through linguistic analysis, as well as the importation of sociological lenses that are appropriate for the Western experience. We call this the etic, outsider view. this outsider view has been applied on the Indian social dynamics by even Indian scholars who are schooled in Western methods. And this is very unfortunate because these lenses are appropriate for the Western experience and they are very ill-fitting for the Indian social dynamics. Nevertheless, there's an attempt to do these kind of things by the modern academia. So that is an important component. Hand in hand with archaeology, we already talked about Maria Gimbutas, we talked about Colin Renfrew. Marshall was one of the persons who discovered the Harappa civilization, for example, so from 1800s to present. And in present times, genetics is also big from 1990s to present. For example, David Reich and other such people. And their works too, with circular dependencies, they directly impact the Indian identity as well as our history. And there are reasons for my saying that genetics is not an independent line of study. It relies upon constraints that are got from linguistics, constraints that are got from archaeology. With these constraints, the mathematical methods of genetics are made to converge. Therefore, this is not an independent line of study. And so on. So this is what we see. These are the reasons why the theory has spread so widely. So again, summarizing this, 5 agencies have created this theory. The colonial invaders in order to divide and rule, the missionaries in order to divide the Indian population and to convert them into Christianity, Eurocentric entities to explain the linguistic affinity between Sanskrit, Latin and Greek, as well as to uphold Eurocentric ideas, the leftist academia in India, which is socialist leaning and uses alien sociological lenses to study Indian dynamics, and Marxist entities. They work to destroy the old order to replace with the new order. In India, the old order is our entire history, Hinduism and so on. By destroying that, they hope to get the utopian Marxist ideas. So we need to examine a multidisciplinary evidence to evaluate any of these narratives. And this is what I've done in several of my talks. One of your questions was, how has the Aryan invasion theory affected the people of India in the past? Would you believe that this is entirely a non-issue? This is a non-issue in Indian past, Indian history, Indian writings, and so on. We can take any number of ancient Indian writers going back thousands of years till about 1800s or 1900s. I've given a sampling of some great names from ancient India, medieval India, and so on over here. Not a single writer here says anything that we are Aryans and somebody else in southern India are Dravidians. Not a single person has said we invaded India or India experienced invasions and there were killings and people going to the south and so on and so forth. Not one person in the Indian context has said anything about Aryan invasion. So it is exceedingly surprising that all of this internal evidence is brushed aside as soon as linguists and colonialists of the last 200 years come with the spiel of the Aryan invasion theory. So this is what is the absurd situation that we face, where we disregard all of the internal evidence in favor of the Western narrator. So how has it affected India, the people of India in the past? Not at all. There is zero evidence. The ancient authors in India saw Indians as one people, never as having been of different kinds of people and so on. There's a common culture and there's common cultural and heritage unity in India. This is what we see. Another part of your question was, how has it affected the people of India in the present? Well, there has been an impact of the spurious Aryan invasion migration narrative, because this narrative positions these Aryans as having come into India in 1500 BCE. It positions them as nomads from Central Asia who destroyed the superior Harappa civilization. And it also says that India had to wait another 1000 years for civilization to come again in the eastern part of India, in Magadha, between 1500 BC to 500 BCE approximately. So the common narrative is that Indians have not had enough time for knowledge generation in mathematics, astronomy, medicine, many other fields of study. Therefore, they say Indians must have learnt all these from the Greeks and Babylonians. So it denies Indians their history, it denies Indians their civilizational knowledge systems, and so on. This is what we are seeing. And in this caricature, I have shown that, for example, it says mathematics and sciences came from Greece into India. It says the script, Brahmi, is derived from Aramaic and came from the Levant into India. It says that from Babylon, Indians learnt astronomy. It says from Central Asia, Indians were Aryans and the Sanskrit came into India. The Turkic Muslims from Central Asia, it says, brought culture, cuisine, architecture, music and civilization into India. It further says that the British got India's science, technology and rational thought. So these are some of the absurd impositions on Indian history because of the Aryan constraints of this Aryan invasion theory. So we are seeing a criminal distortion of the history of the Indian civilization, all the anchor points of Indian chronology, and every aspect of Indian knowledge systems and identity has been distorted primarily because of this constraint of Aryan invasion theory. So denial of history has led to a gross distortion of identity, and today we see a growing divisive forces are there in India based on these spurious ideologies. That is how this spurious Aryan invasion theory is affecting the people of India in the present times. Well, that is a long answer to your first question. Your second question is, in which ways can the theory be proven wrong? And also, how are people proving it right? Again, good questions, so we can take a look at some of them. So in order to disprove the Aryan invasion theory, we had to go to the methodology. And like I said, the methodology is based on linguistics. So we had to seek the researchers who have worked on linguistics and are critiquing it on the basis of linguistic model. So I've got two sample leaders over here. First one is Srikant Thalagiri and the other is Nicholas Kazanas. So Srikant Thalagiri is the author of these two books that contains a lot of his thesis. Additionally, there are his talks on YouTube and several papers that one can read. The central thesis of Srikant Thalagiri's work is that the PIE homeland should be in Northwest India. He says if you place the homeland in Central Asia, everything about it is wrong. Nothing fits the reality correctly. However, if the homeland is situated in Northwest India and if it is a dispersal out of India, it makes perfect sense. And that is a central idea based on many logical and rational arguments. And you might want to see these two books on that. On the other hand, Nicholas Kazanas has examined the comparative stories of the Vedic people as well as the Nordic people, the Scandinavian people, the Celtic people, Germanic people, looking at comparative stories of these ancient cultures. He's trying to come up with the reason for their commonalities and so on. And he says, in his view, all the mainstream academic publications on the subject of reconstructing Proto-Indo-European language are worthless. Very strong statement. His thesis is, if there was an ancestral language, it is so old and so ancient that there is no data available today to reconstruct that language. Therefore, his thesis says all these works are worthless and useless. So this is the only critique I'll offer for the linguistic model. I've discussed a lot more in my works, but one should see the works of Srikant Thalagiri and Kazanas. Continuing, in which ways can the theory be proven? We should see the second methodology now. The first is linguistics, the second is archaeology. Now about archaeology, we have to see when did this idea of invasion come into the question, into the picture itself. And the French scholar Michel Danino in 2016, he wrote a paper in which he's calling out the work of the early archaeologist who discovered Harappa, Marshall. So he says when Marshall worked initially in the Indus Valley civilization at Harappa, he did not envision any contact between Harappans and Aryans. And he proposed that Mohenjo-daro had thrived from 3250 to 2750 BCE, ending more than 1,000 years before the Aryans' supposed arrival in his work in 1931. Danino further says that a second archaeologist, colonial archaeologist called Wheeler, Mortimer Wheeler, he's the one who shifted Marshall's chronology forward in time from 2500 BCE to 1500 BCE in 1947, so that it makes it conveniently possible for invading Aryans to have brought about the end of the Indus cities. So this is how a manufacturing of the invasion was done, by bringing this chronology forward in time so that the linguistic theory can match with the archaeological findings. This is what has been done. At the same period of time, he also identified the Harappan cities, the Purs of Rig Veda. Purs are words used in Sanskrit to identify cities. So he identified them with the Rig Vedic Purs. And he further says he read an account of the Aryan violent conquest of the Dasyus who lived in Purs, saying that all of the Rig Vedic texts seem like a military manual on their conquest of the Dasyus and so on. So he said this seems to be recounting the Aryans' invasion into India. And several people have analyzed these and shown the baselessness of such translations. So going forward, we see that there are some more ways a theory can be proven wrong by looking at archaeology. Embellishment was done. In addition to bringing in the idea of invasion, it was further embellished. For example, the Marxist scholar Kosambi, he wrote an essay in which he says the Indus urban culture came to an end soon after 1750 BCE. The actual termination was abrupt. He says the city was set on fire, inhabitants were slaughtered, evidence of a violent end. Interpret as reality, the figurative old Sanskrit texts where enemies are spoken of as having been ruthlessly smashed in battle, treasures looted, cities burned down, and he calls it the victory of barbarism over a far older and decidedly superior urban culture. So these are the kind of embellishments that are further done by Kosambi by trying to bring in certain adjectives that will mentally give the picture that Rig Veda and the Aryan invasion of India and the archaeology are related. So this is the kind of embellishment done in that time frame. And going forward, we can see that the invasion theory has been challenged by several people. For example, P.V. Kane, who was a noted Sanskrit scholar, in 1953 he says, extrapolating a man-made destruction of a huge city like Mohenjo-daro from the archaeological findings of a few skeletons is wholly unjustified. In 1964, the scholar George Dales, he said even these skeletons belong to different epochs of the city. And it is not a point incident. Skeletons are not clustered at the same point in time, but in different epochs. Further, George Dale said, there is no destruction level covering the latest period of the city. There is no sign of extensive burning, no bodies of warriors clad in armor surrounded by weapons of war. There is not a single bit of evidence that can be brought forth as unconditional proof of an armed conquest and the destruction of the supposed scale of the Aryan invasion. And Kenneth Kennedy is an American scholar, 1982. He further examined some of these bones from the skeletons in Harappa, and he said the injuries of the bones of most Mohenjo-daro skeletons had actually healed well before death. And there's the same situation at Harappa as well. In other words, there is no sign of invasion, widespread invasion, burning down of the city and all of these things, utter embellishments. So what we are seeing is not only is the linguistics challenged, even the archaeology has been challenged today to say there's no such thing as invasion, which is why people are trying to say it is a migration. So we can look at two sides of this debate. On this side, these are the people who support the Aryan invasion theory or the migration theory. On this side are the people who reject the Aryan invasion or migration theory. On this side, they say linguistics implies common ancestral language, homeland for ancestral language, and dispersal by invasions and migrations. On this side, they say that A, B, and C does not prove Central Asian homeland or invasion to India. On this side, they say archaeology in Indus Valley, Harappa shows evidence of destruction. On this side, we have seen experts have weighed in. There is no destruction, no fires, no mass killings, and no such things. These are all embellishments only. On this side, they say genetics using the R1A Z93 genetic signature from Central Asia in India, and that they say implies migration during the linguistic time frame suggested. Now, on this side, people say many scholars have studied this and published papers, and we see there is no consensus to this issue. In fact, the majority opinion is that R1A originated in India and spread outwards. This is what we are seeing in several works, and in my talks, I've called out some of these papers. On this side, they say, wait a minute, there are two races in India, the Aryans and the Dravidians. And on this side, they say, look, the racial theory is bogus. Many genetic studies have been done and they show no significant differences among Indians, Northern Indians, Southern Indians. The genetics are similar. There is no mutation that is standing out saying that this is what is the difference between Aryans and Dravidians. On this side, they say there are two language families in India, Indo-Aryan and Dravidian. On this side, they say, look, India is a language sprackburned. Ancient coexistence of languages for the longest time, languages have been coexisting in India, leading to mixing as well as divergences. So we cannot take the present day languages and reconstruct it to a point and say that here is where Sanskrit comes in and Tamil comes in and those kinds of things. There is much more ancient coexistence over here. Now the Rig Veda talks about the Saraswati River extensively, and this side they say satellite imagery shows an ancient river. Rig Veda is mentioning this flowing mighty river in India. However, this river is known to have dried up in 1900 BCE, 400 years before the alleged Aryans came into India. How could they have seen a dried up river and talked about it in the Rig Veda? That is the question. On this side, they say the river itself is mythical. It is some other river misunderstood as Saraswati. And on astronomy, many ancient dates can be deciphered from the archaeoastronomy present in the ancient Indian texts. On this side, astronomy is unreliable, an opinion that Max Muller has put forth and several people are carrying forward without the due diligence. And we'll talk about this a little later. So concluding on that, in what ways can a theory be proven wrong? I have talked about this extensively in my two talks that I've listed over here, both on Sangam Talks on YouTube. So do see that. I've got a lot of scientific evidence from various fields of study, and I've called it out saying why these oppose the Aryan invasion theory. In summary, my talks show there is no Aryan invasion or migration to India. There is no Harappa Vedic periodization. Rather, the Indian history shows a continuity of the civilization. There is no Harappa period followed by a Vedic period. Rather, we see continuity of the civilization in various metrics from the ancient times to present times. And the same culture existed in ancient India for a very long time. I've shown that the genetics shows antiquity of the Indian people, and there is evidence from multiple disciplines to support these conclusions, and do see these two talks and they address these issues. Your third question. In one of the articles talking about your presentation, Indian astronomy is mentioned as evidence for dismissing the invasion theory. Astronomy is nowadays often seen as nonsense, at least in the Western world. How can a historical theory affecting the history of a country and its people be proven wrong by the said nonsense? How could astronomy be seen as a reliable source of historical events? Well, this question is betraying a lack of understanding about astronomy itself, the methods of astronomy, the history of astronomy, how astronomy has been used by various ancient civilizations, whether it is the Egyptians, the Sumerians, the Babylonians, the Indians, the Chinese, the Greeks, the Romans. It betrays a lack of understanding of that. One has got to see how the ancient people developed astronomy and what kind of impact it has in the present times. And you will see that what you're referring to as nonsense over here is anything but that. So, like I said, your argument itself is factually wrong. It's incorrect. Therefore, it's a non-issue in this discussion. At the high level, we can say that ancient cultures were interested in marking time. How do you mark the passage of time? Today it seems trivial to you that we have got a calendar, or we mark time with watches, clocks, GPS devices, based on atomic devices, based on known frequency or cycles of oscillation of atoms or crystals. We can say that we can make pretty precise measurements of time today with these devices. However, the ancients did not have the benefit of this technology. So they marked time perhaps in the very, very ancient times with notches on bones, or using the shadow of the sun, using sundials, or using water clocks, and perhaps astronomical cycles. Now, astronomical cycles include things like the day and night. That is a cycle, right? So that you can measure the day and night. The solstices and equinox, the winter and the summer solstice along the two equinox points, they form the four cardinal positions of astronomy, and ancients could measure them pretty precisely and mark the solar year based upon these entities. The phases of the moon, by measuring the time it takes for the moon to go from new moon to full moon and back to new moon, you could estimate something called the synodic month, and the moon's backdrop against known backdrop of the stars. So even that, when the moon goes through its passage, every day it rises in the east a little later than the previous day, and therefore it appears against a different backdrop of the stars. How long does it take for the moon to come back to the same backdrop of the stars? It takes approximately 27.3 days, and the ancients knew that. Ancients could also measure the cycles of Jupiter. How long does it take for Jupiter to come back to the same constellation? That's a 12-year cycle. Or how long does it take for Saturn to come back to the same constellation? Ancients had measured that too at 30 years. All of these cyclical phenomena were used in one form or the other to measure the passage of time. And all of these things have been used in ancient India to mark the passage of time rather precisely. So this is one aspect of understanding astronomy which is not nonsense at all, but it is based on very well understood phenomena and the passage of time. There is a second component to what I am doing in my talks, and several others have done before me, and that is to date events of the past using astronomical measurements. Today we got archaeologists who go to the field and dig up an artifact, and based upon several things, like for example looking at the relative layers they have in the soil, or by looking at carbon dating, or by various other mechanisms, an archaeologist might come and with a date for that artifact. In astronomy also we have a notion of archaeology. It's called archaeoastronomy. In archaeoastronomy, we look for an instance of an ancient astronomical observation, and we try to see when could that observation have been made. How do we do this? Because we know several things that are happening in the skies. Like I said, there are so many astronomical cycles that are cyclical. In addition to all of these things, we should also understand about the cycles of the Earth. The Earth spins once in 24 hours. This is the day and night cycle. The Earth goes around the Sun once in 365.24 days. This is a solar year. We know that also. In addition to this, the Earth is doing three more things, which today we identify with the Milankovitch Cycle, for example. The Earth is undergoing something called eccentricity, in which the orbit around the Sun goes through a process where from circular it becomes almost elliptical to circular, and this takes about 100,000 years for this cycle to happen. The second is a tilt cycle. Today we are about 22.1 or so. It goes to 23 to 22.1 or so. So this tilt cycle happens in about 41,000 years. And the third is a precession cycle. In the precession cycle, the axis of rotation of the Earth in the northern hemisphere is pointing to Polaris today. And where it is pointing to is also a measure of the latitude from which you're observing this particular star. For example, in Houston, where I live, it's approximately 29 degrees. And you're in Finland. In Finland, it is closer to perhaps around 80 degrees, 85 degrees. I've not looked it up exactly. You're closer to the North Pole, so it's almost directly overhead. So this axis of rotation, which is pointing to the Polaris, is not constant in the sky because the Earth is undergoing a wobble that is called precession of equinox. This wobble traces a 26,000 year cycle in the sky. In other words, it takes 26,000 to describe where the axis of rotation is pointing to. Today we are pointing to Polaris. About 14,000 years ago, the Earth was pointing at a star called Vega. Vega in India is called Abhijit. It was pointing at Abhijit about 14,000 years ago. 14,000 years from now, once again, Abhijit will be the pole star. What is the consequence of that? Because the Earth is wobbling, and by the way, the reason for the wobble is the gravitational action of the Sun and the Moon and to some extent Jupiter. Because of that, you can liken Earth to a spinning top. If you played with a top as a child, you tie a string around the top and you twirl it, and the top goes very, very fast. And as it is twirling, you can imagine that sometimes there's a wobble to the top where it does this kind of a motion in addition to the fast spin. The fast spin of the Earth is 24 hours. Our Earth is also wobbling in this manner. 24 hours is a fast wobble, and the slow wobble is this 26,000 year precession that I talked about. Because of this precession, the stars that are at the cardinal points that I talked about, the points are the solstice points and the equinox points. These are not constant. They keep changing with time. And in fact, we can measure the rate of change. Approximately, it is 50.3 arc seconds in a year. That is how much the position of a star at a solstice point will change. And it turns out that many of the Indian texts have observed astronomical phenomena at the solstice or equinox points because New Year was observed with the equinox and such things in ancient India. So today those star positions are not matching with what we have today. The ancient observations do not match what we have today. But because we know it is due to the precession phenomena, we can use precise calculation in mathematics, and if you want to use planetarium software like Stellarium or any other things, and you can simulate some of these dates. You can go back several thousand years and you can figure out when was this observation made. So talking about ancient dates using archaeoastronomy is a very precise, independent line of evidence. So one's ignorance should not be conflated with arrogance as nonsense. Rather, students must have the humility to learn. And here is a learning moment. So please do look up Milankovitch Cycles, how it affects the ice ages on Earth and so on. Also look up the precession cycle and look to see how Indian astronomical measurements can be dated using precision. So having said that, there is a lot of evidence from astronomy because concepts are in our ancient texts. And for example, we have something called the nakshatra model, which refers to a division of the ecliptic into 27 segments of 13 and 1/3 degrees each. Ancient Indians had known that in a 24-hour period, the moon traverses 13.3 degrees in the sky. And so they had divided the ecliptic into 27 segments, identified them by the principal brightest stars in that segment of the sky, and given them mnemonics, names to remember. And this nakshatra model, it's called a nakshatra, and this, or a lunar mansion, if you will. So this nakshatra model is mentioned in the ancient texts of Atharva Veda and the Taittiriya Samhita. So we know its antiquity. There is an ancient book called Vedanga Jyotisha that talks about the winter solstice, which we can infer happened in a nakshatra called Dhanishta. So today, because of the precession phenomena, we can date back and see when did the winter solstice last happen at that star that today in India we call Dhanishta. It turns out to be 1400 BCE. There is an ancient Indian text called Shatapatha Brahmana, written by a rishi called Yajnavalkya. So he mentions how Kritika does not swerve from the eastern quarters in reference to the celestial equator on which equinox Kritika is. Kritika is the star constellation we call Pleiades in the Western tradition, and the Pleiades was last on the celestial equator approximately in 2982 BCE, the largest star of Pleiades at least. So in India, we also have a calendar reference system, and this was seen by several European colonialist astronomers also, and I refer you to the work of Lee Gentle. Lee Gentle was a French astronomer who came to India in the 1700s to Pondicherry to make some observations, and he obtained some tables called Tables of Trivellor, and these tables were analyzed by people like Cassini in Italy, and they saw that the tables are arranged to be measured from an absolute date, and that date turns out to be February 18th, 3102 BCE. This is a point when most of the planets were clustered in a certain nakshatra called Revati, which is Zeta Piscium, if you will, and this is dated to 3102 BCE. Additionally, I have called out several episodes of archaeoastronomical observations in texts. Rig Veda, for example, referring to Aditi in the vernal equinox at something called Punarvashu Nakshatra. This is the same as Castor and Pollux. Castor and Pollux in the Greek tradition. In India, it is Diti and Aditi and the Punarvashu Nakshatra. It refers to the vernal equinox. Vernal equinox was last over there in 6000 BCE. We also have the Ashwini. Ashwini Nakshatra is the heliacal rising of Ashwini. This can be dated to 7200 BC and so on. Many archaeoastronomical observations are there in Hindu texts, which can be dated very precisely using our modern understanding of precision and how much of what the precision rate is. By working backwards in time, we can very definitely measure these things. So to call this nonsense is ridiculous because it is betraying ignorance of the methods rather than an informed decision making. Now, when several European scholars observed these ancient mathematical entities in Indian astronomy, and they questioned Max Muller. Max Muller was a person who was translating the Sanskrit texts, and they confronted Max Muller and asked him, why are you dating all the Indian texts from 1500 BCE to 200 BCE based on linguistic analysis? Because these same texts have got astronomical measurements that are much more ancient. Max Muller could not give a proper answer for this. He wrote an entire book on this. His response ultimately was, I am not going to rely on any of the Indian texts because they are unreliable. He only accepted the date for Vedanga Jyotisha to 1400 BCE because a fellow European called Colebrook, he had also dated this to 1400 BCE, but he rejected all the other dates because it did not fit with his biblical model. At that time, Max Muller believed that God created the world in 4004 BCE. God destroyed the world in 3000 BCE, Noah's flood. Nothing could have survived that flood event. Therefore, none of Indian astronomy can be dated to such ancient times. He believed in that, and we know that from his writings. I've called that out in some of my talks, so you might like to see that. So Max Muller's attitude was that Indian texts are unreliable and therefore should not be used for any dating. He preferred only the linguistic analysis. So I have shown exhaustively in my talks that linguistics can be critiqued on the methodology that it has come from, and we should certainly examine it rationally and logically. I quoted two scholars, both Talagiri as well as Nicholas Kazanas, who have critiqued this. Then I've said, look at archaeology, and we have critiqued the invasion model and said that this invasion model does not hold as per the expert opinions of several researchers who have said there is no sign of invasion. There's a continuity of civilization and there's no Harappa or Indus Valley period followed by Vedic period. Then we have gone and said there is no migration either by looking at the genetic information, and said that no, even the genetics in India, many dozens and dozens of studies have been reported saying that if you take something called fixation index, FST, if you measure that for the Indians, it looks like there is no difference among the northern Indian or southern Indians, whereas the linguistic model proposes an Aryan Dravidian racial division. So repeatedly examining the evidence logically, we are seeing that there is no invasion, there is no migration. It is an out of India migration. We are seeing that. And why would one discard the internal evidence? This is the same Eurocentric arrogance and nonsense that we see, that when hundreds and thousands of Indian authors from ancient times to medieval times, none of them have talked about we are two people in India, that there is an invasion into India, that there is a conflict model. None of them have mentioned that. They've talked about a common culture all the time, but we ignore all that evidence, internal evidence. Indian texts talk about ancient astronomical measurements. Once again, the arrogance comes into play and we ignore these things as nonsense. So we need to be rational, we need to be logical, we need to be honest, and we need to examine the evidence for what it is. If you want to dismiss something as nonsense, it should be on the basis of more than emotive words like nonsense, which is illogical opinions. Rather, one should give the reasons why you will discard astronomical observations. Then that can be accepted. Otherwise, one will not take these kind of opinions seriously at all, because the evidence is overwhelming that such opinions are wrong. Okay, your fourth question. You claim that the Marxists are in control of how the history of India is thought and known. How is that possible? What evidence do you have to support this claim? Thank you for this question. It's a good one. So there are several agencies who are responsible for the narrative of Indian history, and I've called this out. There are 5 agencies that subvert, the correct word is subvert, Indian history. It starts with the colonialists. Look, Indians for the longest time had something called Puranas, Sthala Puranas, they had got Itihasas. These were our notions of history. We also had traditionally in many areas people who would note down family genealogies, and we have got in northern India several places where they mention genealogies for many generations. So this has been our idea of history for the longest time. When the colonial people came to India, they started looking at Indian history in a different way for their purposes, and they came, like I said, with a biblical idea. God created the world 4004 BCE. By 3000 BC, Noah's flood. Also, they believed in the Hamitic tradition, where Noah's sons Ham, Shem, and Japheth, and they believed in the racial ideas emanating from the biblical stories. For example, that Noah cursed his son Ham, that he'll have to serve the descendants of Japheth and Shem. Japheth's descendants are the white Europeans. Shem's descendants are the Jewish people. And finally, Ham's descendants are the remaining colored people. So this was seen as the justification for slavery for more than 2000 years in the Western experience. And so we see that colonial people came with these retrogressive, backward, primitive ideas when they approached the history of India. So they imposed their ideology over here. And like I said, they were soon followed by the Eurocentric people who wanted to know, why is the European languages of Latin and Greek, why are they related to Sanskrit? Are they related to the Indian people in some way? What should the relationship be, and how should that be done? So they came with certain ideas on that narrative in the 19th century, and we see the lingering effects of that even today. The missionaries, like I said, they came with the idea, always wherever colonial people went, missionaries were not far behind, because they came with a papal bull. The papal bull which said that any place where the Catholics go, they can claim it for Christendom. So with those ideas, they came to convert the people and so on. And they came and translated Indian texts with a very motivated means, so that what we call atrocity literature or hate literature, that was generated with the missionaries to divide and conquer. So when the racial ideas that there were Aryan and Dravidian races came about, when the Aryan invasion theory came about, the missionaries used this for their benefit by telling the southern Indian that you are an oppressed people, that you are oppressed by the fair-skinned North Indian, and you are poor because of the fair-skinned North Indian that subjugated you. So they were able to make people angry because of the kind of situation the colonial impoverishment of India had caused. By diverting that to this kind of an Aryan invasion, they were able to convert people in the south. So they came with their interests. After India got rid of the British, 1947, the leftist academia has taken over. Unfortunately, they have looked up to the West for their methodologies, and they have imported the Western lens, the socialist lens, and all of academia today has this bias. And they were also followed by the Marxist lens, and I'll talk about that presently. So we are seeing that history plus ideologies has led to a subversion of identity. And Indian identity can be seen as a combination of our history, our culture, our heritage, our traditions, and our beliefs. That is the Indian identity. But that has been deeply subverted by these 5 agencies today. So you asked, how is it possible that Marxists are controlling the Indian framework? And I'll show that. The Marxist framework is destroying our identity and history. And we need to talk about Marx. So Marx, he argued that all of history is a history of class struggles. The working class will triumph over the capital class and win control over the means of production, forever erasing all classes, this famed utopian society which the Marxists are chasing through a bloody revolution, if you will. And in India, we have had the Nehruvian socialists who have been in power in academia since 1947, including the ruling classes. And if you look at the differences between socialism and communism, there really isn't much. In communism, they see a violent revolution and to achieve this communist state. Socialism, it is trying to see the same overthrowing of the old order by seeking change and reform through democratic means. So through the existing political structure. Otherwise, they are basically joined at the hip, whether it is communism or socialism. And today we see in India, these ideas are there pervasively, where the old ways are seen, or the traditional ways, I should say, not the old ways, but traditional ways are seen as primitive, retrogressive, necessary to throw them away for progress. All these ideas have come in light of chasing certain ideas which they come about with. So in India, the father of Marxist historiography is Kosambi, D.D. Kosambi, who lived from 1907 to 1966. He was a critic of Western narration, but he employed a very strong Marxist lens. So he studied ancient history, Sanskrit works, very intelligent man. He wrote 4 books and 60 articles on laying the foundation of Marxist historiography itself in India. And he was followed by a lot of people. For example, R.S. Sharma. He was the Dean of Delhi University's History Department, and he was a founding chairman of a powerful body called Indian Council of Historical Research. He's authored about 115 books in 15 languages, and he influenced the major decisions related to historical research in India in his various roles as chairman, head of the department, and several other bodies that he controlled. So he was able to allow only one kind of scholarship to be promoted, and that is a Marxist scholarship. That is what we see in his works. Another famous Marxist historian is Romila Thapar. So she's well known for her way of looking at Indian history through the Marxist lens, and which utterly distorts the social dynamics of India, brings in the conflict dynamics, the oppressor-oppressed kind of conflict dynamic is imported into India, and this kind of dynamic is used to describe all social interactions in history and in present times, mapping the present day perversions into the past. All of these things have been codified by Romila Thapar, and at JNU, which is Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi, she has influenced many generations of students to follow the Marxist historiography. Third person, Satish Chandra. He was a professor of history at JNU in Delhi. Along with other people like Gopal, Bipin Chandra, Romila Thapar, they co-founded Center for Historical Studies at JNU. He was the chairperson of that for a few years and also the president of the Indian History Congress, another powerful mechanism where only certain kind of papers and researches would be allowed into the discourse. Yet another person is Bipin Chandra, another communist historian. He did his postgraduate studies at Stanford. However, he was involved in the communist movement in 1949 to 50 and deported during the McCarthyan era in the USA. Came back to India, became a lecturer in Delhi, became a professor, and he was the forefront of communist activities in India, controlling the National Book Trust and other such places. And one more person, Irfan Habib, another Marxist historian who identifies a Marxist, uses Marxist historiography in his work, and done several works which again continue this, including distorting the real historical record, for example, in the Ram Temple of Ayodhya, where the Supreme Court found the real facts are contrary to his assertions and rapped him on his knuckles for the incorrect testimony that he had provided regarding the historical antecedents of the Ram Temple in Ayodhya. One more person, D.N. Jha, who again has come with a very vitiated discussion on Indian history by trying to show that there is something called a Hindu nationalist ideology, which he claims is communal and saffronization. So these kind of weaponized words have been introduced by the Marxists whenever critiques to their ideology come along and present works. Now, one would expect that if somebody is an academic, they would welcome critical viewpoints. They'll analyze the critical viewpoint and say, this is where your theory is wrong, this is where I am right. It's an opportunity for them to try and defend their position. However, in India, we see that the Marxist historians cannot defend their positions because these are received wisdom of linguists, colonial historians, and other motivated ideologies. Using science and evidence, we are able to disrupt this kind of a narrative. Instead of addressing these narratives for what they are worth in a rational, logical manner and examining the evidence, they come with weaponized words like communalism, saffronization, and so on, in an effort not to listen to the claims coming from people who are uncovering new facts. So this is the way they squash any new research coming from people who are bringing in ideas that are contrary to Marxist historians. One more person, Panikkar, communist historian. So he too has expressed several kind of ideas over there. He is appointed by the southern state of Kerala as a chairman expert committee in textbooks in state-sponsored schools and so on. And the facilitators. So Nurul Hassan, he was the minister during 72 to 77. He was a strong leftist. He founded this ICHR in New Delhi. He is the architect behind setting up of 27 social science research institutes, and he was instrumental in the career advancement of many leftist college, university teachers in India and impacting political neutrality of education. So we see that India has been thoroughly compromised in its education by the Marxists and their supporters. And how did he come to power? He came to power because of political wheeling and dealing. This is Indira Gandhi, who in 1969 to 71, for political survival, she made a pact with the communists for their support for her political survival. The communists demanded the human rights department and the education sectors for their control. And Nurul Hassan was appointed as the Minister for HRD, Culture, Education in 1972. And like I said, he created, appointed, controlled the entire ecosystem of leftist Marxist education. All these agencies were set up by him and controlled by him. And they completely eradicated the non-leftist, non-Marxist scholarship in India over the course of the last 50 to 60 years. What we have seen is entirely the Indian thought has gone out of Indian education in India or in USA or Europe or elsewhere. And what we are seeing is predominantly the socialist Marxist scholarship survives in textbooks and other areas. This is what we are seeing today. So I hope this addresses your question, how Marxist education system is present in India. Your fifth question. In the video on Sangam Talks YouTube channel, you claim your presentation that all non-African people descend from Indian stock. Are you claiming that the area of India would have had its own evolution that lead to the exact same Homo sapiens as the evolution in Africa? Or are you claiming that after leaving Africa, the Homo sapiens first headed to the area of India and only then to Europe and other parts of Asia until spreading to other continents as well? What evidence is there of this happening? So to talk about only two possibilities is also incorrect, because we don't know. All we can do is look at the evidence and make the best inferences that we can. So today there are some people who are inferring that it is an out of Africa. The modern Homo sapien arose out of Africa and it has and is dispersed throughout the world. And one should ask the question, did Homo sapien come in a vacuum? Did the DNA of Homo sapien come all of a sudden 200,000 years ago? Or did they descend from earlier specimens of humans? And that is the correct answer. So they derived from earlier species of humans, if you will. And these are, we know that there were Neanderthals, we know there were Homo erectus, we know that there were several other species of humans, the Denisovans and so on. So the picture is not very, very clear. However, with empty DNA and with Y chromosomal research, there are several people claiming that origin of Homo sapiens can be about 200 to 250,000 years ago in Africa, and out of Africa to India and then spreading to Europe. And that is what I'd like to present over here. So research has shown something called the phylogenetic tree of human empty DNA haplogroups. So basically it means that if there is an ancient ancestor who had a mutation, remember that during meiosis we have the chromosomes that recombine and make copies. These copies are not exact. Chromosomal copies are not exact. You can have a situation where sometimes a portion of the chromosome of the genes are missing. Sometimes there's an inversion in a portion of the genes. Sometimes there is a duplication. All kinds of errors can happen in the copying of chromosomes during the meiosis process and so on. And this is well known to biological scientists, and they postulate a mutation rate also, statistically obviously, that talks about some of these changes. These changes can then be inherited by the descendants, and we can track then, going back in time, looking at fossilized remains and such things. We can say, when did a certain mutation occur in the human record? This is how most of the ancestral migration tracking is done, by looking at differences in the genome of present humans and comparing them sometimes with ancient skeletal remains, DNA remains from ancient samples and so on. We are able to reconstruct something of a migration picture. And for the maternal mitochondrial DNA, empty DNA, we have a picture that has emerged today, which says that the mutations that are referred to as L0 to L6 arose in Africa, and out of Africa we see M and N as the major lineages, and from M and N we see the rest of the world lineages. For example, Africa's L0 to L6, and all of this West Eurasian or East Eurasian is derived from M and N, and the remaining Native Americans as well as Australians and others are derived from the same pool. So this is what we are seeing. And we take a look at this map. This one shows the mitochondrial haplogroups, the antiquity of them. It shows L0 to L6 is entirely in Africa. Out of Africa, we see this lineage coming here into the area that is India. We see the M, N, and R in India. And from this, we see migrations going eastwards as well as westwards all over the place. If you look at this color coding, this black color here refers to 90 to 55,000 years ago from India. And this orange here refers to 55 to 30,000 years ago. This is not surprising because we know from the Milankovitch cycles I talked about earlier that there was an ice age in this part of Europe, and because of that ice age, there's a barrier obviously, and the people living there were the Neanderthals. The Neanderthals lived up to Iran, from the areas of Europe up to Iran. When the ice ages ended around 50,000 years ago, that also coincided with the dying out of the Neanderthal. And that vacuum was filled by Homo sapiens from this part of the world, which is India. They spread to these parts in Europe and so on. And we also see that this group has moved on all the way to North and South America, as well as Polynesia, depending on these timelines that are shown over here. So one can see that it is out of Africa to India, and from India it seeds the rest of the world in this time frames that we are seeing, from 55,000 years, 30,000 years, 10,000 years, and so on. Now, the women cannot have done it alone, so there has to be a male presence also. And the question is, do we see a similar picture in the male Y haplogroups? Remember the gender chromosomes X and Y? We saw the maternal mitochondrial DNA in the previous slide. Here you're seeing the Y chromosome haplogroups. And this one too posits that mutations A00 till C, all these haplogroups are in Africa, and out of Africa the major lineages are F, G, H, I, J, K, L, which are all found in the vicinity of India or in India, and from here going to the rest of the world. And this R also is a component that is in India going to the rest of the world. This is what we see over here. And if you take a look at this map, it shows similarly that all of these are inside Africa, from A0 to E and others. And this black line coming out of here is showing that 100 to 50,000 years ago, this lineage comes into India, the F, C, K, D, R, and other such things, and spreading from here 25,000 years to 10,000 years in this orange maps going out, the blue line 50 to 25,000 years into Europe and other places, and so on. So once again, we are seeing that, yes, parallel with the maternal mitochondrial DNA migration story, we are seeing women did not go alone. Their men also were with them, and the Y haplogroups are also showing a similar migration pattern. So we are seeing it is out of India in both these pictures. Once it is out of Africa, it is from India that the dispersal has happened to various parts of the world. This can also be seen in the set of illustrations provided by Stephen Oppenheimer. So Stephen Oppenheimer, in the book Out of Eden or The Real Eve, he's showing that around before 150,000 years ago is when the Homo sapiens arose in some place in Africa, and around 85 to 75,000 years ago, he says a group of individuals left Africa, hugged the coastline over here through the triangular part of India all the way to Sumatra and other places, and he says that this was a generation by generation migration. It is not somebody just walking constantly over here, but generation by generation migration in this time frame that led to this dispersal. They also perhaps did not go westwards, like I said, because there was one more species called Neanderthals, and they may not have wanted to be in competition with them, so they hugged this coastline and went in this route. Then Stephen Oppenheimer is also pointing out that about 75 to 74,000 years ago, there was a super volcano in Sumatra called Mount Toba. And that caused a 6-year nuclear winter, instant 1,000-year ice age. This is not an ordinary volcano, but a super volcano. It caused a dramatic population crash to less than 10,000 adults. He further says volcanic ash from the eruption was up to 5 meters deep in India and Pakistan, which is quite a bit. Even today in the state of Andhra Pradesh, in Jwalapuram, we are finding the ash layer there. We are finding human artifacts above the ash layer and human artifacts under the ash layer, showing that human habitation was there before the Mount Toba event and also after the Mount Toba event. So this is very interesting to see this particular one. Then 74 to 65,000 years ago, repopulation of India took place, whereas this original group has migrated all the way by now to Australia. And going to 65 to 52,000 years ago, there was this dramatic warming of the climate 52,000 years ago, and people moved out of this area to the Fertile Crescent through the Levant, moved into Europe via Bosphorus from about 50,000 years ago, entering into Europe in this manner. And here they have pushed into Australia itself. And by 45 to 40,000 years ago, groups of individuals from this part of India, from Sumeria, from eastern part of India, they are moving into the Siberia. This is what the mtDNA research is showing. And by 40 to 25,000 years ago, we see that they have gone further into Europe, and this group of individuals are crossing the Bering Strait, maybe there was a land bridge at that time, into North America and South America. So I hope I have addressed your 5 questions over here and given you answers that try to show you where I'm coming from. So once again, I appreciate and welcome your questions. And I repeatedly say students should question everything, and you should seek rational, logical answers that are factual and evidence-based. Students must be able to recognize and reject opinions, those that are not supported by facts. The facts can arise out of scientific evidence and so on. If they are not evidence-based, one must reject opinions, especially if evidence comes contrary to those opinions. History is an area where one should re-examine the narratives of received wisdom with cold, hard facts, and one should propose better narratives that fit the evidence and be open to change as new facts are uncovered. Okay, once again, thank you and namaste.